He is 50 years old, and the night has taught his body to wake before danger arrives. In a colony where sugar grows fat and men grow thin, he sleeps in fragments, ear to the ground, breath held, as if the air itself might betray him. The cane leaves sliced skin like paper. The huts keep rain, but not dignity. A man learns to reuse tea leaves, to chew slow, to trick his own hunger into silence. He has spent decades watching boys become old in a single season, watching names vanish into ledgers, the way blood disappears into dirt. And when whispers of change crawl in from across the ocean, the world answers him with laughter. He is told, not kindly, that he is nothing but a tool that somehow learned to speak, too old to matter, too careful to lead. The kind of man who survives, not the kind who changes anything. Men in clean coats call him by the same word they use for a mule, useful, and when usefulness ends, so does mercy. Yet today, the same world that counted him like property studies him like a threat. His mind will outmaneuver generals. His decisions will scorch empires. Napoleon Bonaparte, who believes he can bend continents, will discover that one Caribbean island can become a graveyard for ambition. So how does a man born in chains become the strategist who breaks Napoleon's dream and helps pull a nation out of slavery by the root? Saint-Domingue did not look like a prison from the sea. It looked like Eden that had learned to count. Green mountains rising behind bright towns, harbors thick with masts, warehouses sweating with sugar and coffee, the air sweet enough to deceive a stranger for a heartbeat, but step inland and the sweetness curdled. The roads were stitched with mud and crushed cane. The fields ran like endless teeth. And in those rows, bodies moved with a rhythm that was not work but extraction, human time boiled down into profit. This was the richest colony in the world because it was the cruelest with the least shame. Sugar was not grown. It was forced out of earth with the same violence used to force obedience out of people. There were mornings when the cane cut you before the overseer did. There were nights when the smell of molasses mixed with the stink of infected wounds, sweet rot, a perfume for men who would never taste the luxury their labor financed. In the great houses, plates clinked and candles burned clean. In the slave quarters, light was rationed like mercy. The true villain here wasn't only a whip in a single hand. It was the entire logic that made the whip feel reasonable. It was paperwork that turned a person into a line of ink. It was the idea that wealth should flow like a river, from black backs to white pockets, and that the universe itself approved. The colony breathed that idea into every one, planter, overseer, merchant, soldier, until it became ordinary the way weather becomes ordinary. If a man collapsed in the field, the cane did not stop growing. If a woman screamed in the night, the sugar ships still sailed. In that world, fear was the first language children learned. Not fear of the dark, but fear of footsteps. Fear of a door opening at the wrong hour. Fear of being noticed, because attention was rarely a blessing. Survival meant learning when to look down and when to look empty. It meant swallowing anger until it turned into stone. It meant watching your own thoughts, because even thoughts could get you killed if they ever slipped out through your face, and somewhere inside that machine, a boy named Toussaint was born into a life already decided by someone else's appetite. He enters history the way most enslaved people do, as a shadow moving across someone else's property. The plantation is called Breda, near Cap Français, one of the beating hearts of the colony. The fields are wide enough to swallow a life whole. The work is heavy, the punishment's heavier, and the rule is simple. You do not get to be a person here. You get to be useful. That is the closest thing to love the system offers. But usefulness can become a hiding place. Toussaint is not built like the mythical strongman people expect a revolutionary to be. He is observant, controlled, the kind of man whose power lives behind his eyes. On plantations, that kind of intelligence is dangerous. Dangerous because it notices patterns, because it remembers, because it might someday connect the dots, that the master's prey remains scattered. So the smart ones learn camouflage. They become quiet. They become dependable. They become the kind of good slave that planters praise, not realizing the praise is a blindfold. The Breda plantation, like all plantations, is a universe of roles. There are cane cutters whose hands are ruined before they reach adulthood. There are drivers who enforce the overseer's will, trapped between the threat above them and the hatred below them. There are domestic servants, close enough to smell the perfume of freedom without ever touching it. Toussaint moves through this universe and learns it the way a prisoner learns guards' routines, patiently, obsessively, because knowledge is the one thing they can't take from you unless you reveal it. He gets near horses, and horses become his teachers. Horses obey power, but also sense weakness. Horses respond to calm, to timing, to a hand that does not tremble. Toussaint learns to handle them, to care for them, to read sickness and strain. On a plantation, that skill is currency. A man who can keep valuable animals alive is useful in a way that buys him a sliver of space. Space to listen, space to watch, space to collect pieces of the world outside the cane rows. And in that space, something else begins to happen, something that should not happen, something the system tries to prevent as if it were a contagious disease. He learns to read. Sometimes it comes through a sympathetic overseer, sometimes through a priest, sometimes through stolen moments and borrowed pages. The origin matters less than the transformation, because once a man can read, the world stops being only what he's told. Words become doors. Scripture becomes more than forced sermons. It becomes a language for justice and deliverance. A pamphlet becomes a spark. A rumor becomes a map. That does not make him free. It makes him dangerous. And still, Toussaint does not explode. He does not shout. He does not rush headfirst into martyrdom. He learns the deeper lesson of survival. You don't fight a machine by throwing your body into its gears. You fight it by learning how it moves. Outside the fields, Saint-Domingue is splitting into layers like rotten wood. At the top sit the Grands Blancs, great white planters and merchants, men who speak of civilization while building fortunes on torture. Beneath them are the Petits Blancs, poor whites, clerks and artisans, men with no plantations, but a fierce attachment to whiteness because it's the only status they can afford. And then there are the free people of color, some wealthy, some educated, some even owning property, yet always reminded that their skin is a ceiling they cannot break. And beneath all of them, the vast majority enslaved Africans and their descendants held down by force, outnumbering the free, outnumbering the masters, yet kept fragmented by terror and distance. Every group has its own bitterness. Every group believes it is being cheated. That is how the colony keeps itself alive, by making sure everyone is angry at the wrong enemy. Then, across the Atlantic, France begins to tremble. In 1789, the old order in Paris cracks open. Words like rights and citizen spill into the world like a flood. In the salons and assemblies of France, people argue about liberty the way men argue about the weather, loudly, confidently, as if their voices can shape reality. But the colony hears those words differently. In Saint-Domingue, rights is not philosophy. It is gunpowder. White planters want autonomy from France so they can protect slavery without interference. Poor whites want equality with rich whites, but not with anyone darker than themselves. Free people of color hear the revolution's slogans and ask the obvious question, if all men are born equal, what does that make us? And the enslaved, who are rarely invited into these debates, who are spoken about like livestock, listen anyway. They don't need pamphlets to understand the meaning of liberty. They understand it in their backs, in their ankles, in the names of children sold away. The colony becomes a room filling with smoke. In 1790, a free man of color named Vincent Auger tries to force the issue. He demands political rights promised in France, and when he is crushed, he is executed with a brutality designed to send a message. The message is not subtle. Even free black men can be broken. Even educated black men can be made into an example. The wheel turns, the screams travel, the ashes settle, and everyone learns something from it. The masters learn they can still terrorize the color line into obedience. The oppressed learn that asking politely is a slow way to die. Toussaint watches all of this with the patience of a man counting bullets he doesn't yet have. He sees the way the whites fracture into rival camps. He sees the way France's chaos gives the colony permission to tear itself apart. He sees opportunity, but he also sees the trap. Rebellions that rise too fast get isolated, then massacred. Hope that shows itself too openly gets hunted down. So he stays in the shadows. He listens. He learns names. He learns routes through hills and passes. He learns which men are rash and which are disciplined, which are brave and which are simply desperate. He learns how the colony's economy breathes, how sugar moves, how supplies arrive, where the bottlenecks are, which ports matter, which roads are arteries. He learns, in other words, the anatomy of the beast. And the beast grows hungry. Because Saint-Domingue is not only slavery, it is a competition of greed. Plantations expand, the demand for labor never ends. Ships keep arriving with new captives ripped from Africa people, carrying languages, religions, scars, and memories of freedom. These newcomers bring fresh rage. They bring fresh spiritual traditions. They bring the knowledge that in some places men are not born as property, and they are thrown into a system that tries to erase all of that with violence. But erased does not mean gone. In the nights, in hidden gatherings, people speak. They whisper stories of Africa. They share prayers. They remember names that plantations tried to replace with numbers and French syllables. They pass around fragments of news. France is fighting itself. The king is weakened. White men are distracted. Gods are listening. At some point, the colony crosses a line where fear is no longer enough. Because fear can control a man who believes tomorrow might be better. But fear cannot control a man who believes tomorrow will be exactly the same. By 1791, the pressure is unbearable. The cruelty feels louder, as if the system senses the ground shifting and tightens its grip. Rumors multiply. Some say France has abolished slavery. Others say the planters will kill the enslaved rather than lose their wealth. Some say the British will invade. Some say Spain is offering freedom to anyone who fights France. Every rumor is gasoline. The truth matters less than the belief that change is possible, and that possibility is the most dangerous substance in Saint-Domingue. Toussaint stands inside this storm as a man who has survived long enough to understand the cost of miscalculation. He is old by the colony's standards, an age when many enslaved men have already been worked into graves. That age is not weakness. It is proof. Proof that he knows how to endure. Proof that he has learned the secret art of staying alive in a place designed to consume you. And now, as the colony begins to crack, endurance is about to become something else. Because when the first fires rise and the first plantations begin to burn, the world will discover that the people it called property have been watching the whole time, counting, learning, waiting. And among them is a man the system never saw coming. Not a reckless young warrior, not a loud prophet, but a careful mind that has been sharpening itself for decades in silence. The first nights of the uprising did not feel like a revolution. They felt like lightning, finally choosing where to strike. In the northern plain, fire began to move from plantation to plantation like a rumor with teeth. Cane fields that had swallowed generations became torches. The sky glowed a violent orange, and the smoke carried a smell that was both sweet and horrifying. Burnt sugar, burnt wood, burnt flesh, and the sudden shock of masters realizing the world could be taken from them in a single night. The colony had been built on the assumption that the enslaved were too broken to coordinate, too afraid to dream together. Now that assumption was burning as loudly as the great houses. The planters called it savagery. They said the Africans had gone mad. But madness doesn't organize. Madness doesn't spread with strategy. Madness doesn't choose targets, sabotage mills, cut roads, sever communication, and choke a colonial economy at its softest points. What was happening was not mindless. It was a kind of intelligence that had been forced underground for so long it learned to live without light. Toussaint watched the first wave the way a surgeon watches, bleeding calm enough to see what others miss. This was not a bar fight. This was a war being born, and wars were not won by anger alone. Anger was fuel. It was not steering. In those early hours, he did not ride out at the head of screaming men. That is what legends prefer. But legends are written by people who weren't there. Reality was more complex, and complexity is where Toussaint lived. He moved through a collapsing world with an eye for what would matter in 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. Who had guns? Who had powder? Who had food? Who had discipline? Who had the kind of patience that could survive victory without dissolving into chaos? And there was another truth, colder than any moral slogan. The rebellion could be crushed. The French had soldiers. The planters had militias. The ports could bring reinforcements. The colony was still connected to a European state that, even while shaking, still understood how to punish. If the rebels became a scattered storm of revenge, they would be hunted one pocket at a time, and the sugar machine would rebuild itself on fresh graves. Toussaint had seen enough to know what uncontrolled rage looks like after the cavalry arrives. So his turning point was not a speech. It was a decision made in silence. If freedom was going to be more than a moment, it would need structure, it would need supply, it would need intelligence, it would need a mind that understood the enemy's habits. And the enemy, in Saint-Domingue, was not only white men with whips. It was also the chaos that could devour a revolt from the inside. He began to operate like a man who had finally stopped asking permission from history. He became useful in a new way. The uprising created armies almost overnight. But armies need more than bodies. They need medicine when sickness spreads through crowded camps. They need someone who can read orders, forge passes, interpret letters, understand maps that were never meant for black hands. They need a man who can negotiate, who can translate between languages and factions, who can hear the lie inside a promise. Toussaint moved into that space, first organizer, mediator, provider, because it was the one space where a careful mind could shape events without being crushed by them. He helped secure supplies. He helped coordinate movement. He helped connect men who would otherwise remain separate fires. He learned which leaders could be trusted with power and which would drown in it. And then, when the moment was right, he stepped closer to the center. The colony was now a battlefield with too many flags. White planters fought for their wealth and the right to keep slavery forever. French commissioners arrived carrying revolutionary language. But those words came wrapped in politics, compromise, and the constant fear of angering France's merchants. Britain watched greedily from nearby islands, seeing profit in conquest. Spain, ruling the eastern side of the island, saw an opening to weaken France. And among the black insurgents, alliances were fragile, driven by immediate survival more than ideology. This is where Toussaint's revenge on the world began to take a specific form. He would use the empire's own rivalries against it. Spain was the first door that opened wide enough to walk through. The Spanish offered support to insurgent leaders willing to fight France. Weapons, uniforms, commissions, legitimacy. Some of the rebel forces took that offer not because they loved Spain, but because Spain was offering what France was not offering yet, a path that looked like power. In a war like this, you couldn't fight musket fire with purity. You fought it with powder. Toussaint accepted a Spanish commission, and in doing so, became something the planters never believed possible. A black commander operating in the language of European war. He was not just leading raids. He was coordinating campaigns. He was turning the landscape into a weapon-using mountains for cover, rivers for movement, plantations for supply, and the enemy's arrogance as an invitation to ambush. He built a reputation that traveled faster than any horse. His forces moved with discipline that unsettled French officers. Where others burned indiscriminately, Toussaint burned strategically. Where others fought like desperate men, he fought like a man, imagining the aftermath. He understood that terror could be useful, but also self-defeating. Too much terror would harden enemies and frighten potential allies. Too little would invite betrayal. So he walked the line like a tightrope walker above a pit. enough violence to make the old world bleed, enough control to keep the new world from collapsing before it was born. And still, he was never fighting only outside enemies. Inside the revolution, there were men who wanted freedom but also wanted dominance. There were leaders who believed the uprising should end with them wearing the same boots the masters once wore. There were fighters who thought victory meant burning everything, even the possibility of a society afterward. Toussaint learned to handle those forces the way he handled horses, firm, calm, never letting them sense fear. But the most dangerous enemy was France's ability to change its mask. Because while Toussaint was fighting under the Spanish banner, France was transforming. The revolution in Paris turned more radical. The old king's world was dying, and Saint-Domingue was no longer just a colony. It was a test of what the word liberty actually meant when black people demanded it for themselves. French commissioners in the colony began to realize something that made their stomachs turn. If France didn't offer freedom, it would lose everything. The whites were divided. The British threatened invasion. The Spanish were arming insurgents. The colony was slipping away. And then the unthinkable began to become policy. Emancipation first in parts of the colony, then declared more broadly, and eventually ratified by the revolutionary government in France. The system that had claimed slavery was eternal suddenly spoke a new language. It claimed, with ink and signatures, that the enslaved were now free. In Toussaint's world, paper had never been strong enough to stop a whip. So when the French began to talk abolition, the question wasn't whether the words were beautiful. The question was whether the words would survive the moment the guns quieted. Still, Toussaint understood something most men miss in the heat of war. Revolutions are not only fought with bullets. They are fought with legitimacy. Whoever claims the moral center, whoever controls the narrative, whoever can say, "We are the future." With the force of an army behind it, that side becomes harder to destroy. Spain had offered him weapons. France was now offering something larger, a legal abolition backed by a revolutionary state that could, at least in theory, make freedom a law rather than a rumor. But shifting allegiance in a war like this is not a simple turn. It is a knife cut through relationships, through trust, through identity. Men who fought beside you yesterday might hunt you tomorrow. Soldiers might defect. Rivals might call you traitor. Toussaint knew the price of changing flags, and he paid it anyway, because he had finally chosen what he was loyal to. Not to Spain, not to France, not to a king or a republic. He chose loyalty to emancipation as a fact that could not be reversed. He chose the side that, at that moment, had declared slavery illegal. He chose the side that gave him the strongest foundation to protect that abolition with force. When Toussaint switched to the French side, it was not surrender. It was a strategic theft. He took with him experience, intelligence, and men who trusted him because he had already kept them alive when the world wanted them dead. He took the habits of European war that he had learned under Spain and turned them against Spain. He took the colony's geography, its mountains, ravines, forests, and fever swamps, and made it part of his army. He made promises with the clarity of a man who knew the cost of broken ones: no return to slavery. Not today, not tomorrow, not under any flag. The war reshaped itself around him. French officers who once dismissed black fighters now had to negotiate with a black general who understood logistics better than they did. White planters who dreamed of restoring the old order now faced a new kind of enemy. A man who could speak their language, read their letters, predict their moves, and destroy their plans without theatrics. And the moment Toussaint committed himself to making emancipation permanent, the revolution stopped being only an uprising. It became a project of turning formerly enslaved people into citizens who could defend their freedom. A project of building an army disciplined enough to fight European powers and ruthless enough to survive betrayal. A project of proving through victory that black freedom was not a temporary concession, but a reality that could be enforced. That is when the world's rejection began to taste like panic. Because the men who had called him too old, too careful, too small to matter, were now forced to understand the worst kind of truth for an empire. The person you dismissed has been studying you longer than you've been studying yourself. And he is no longer asking if he's allowed to win. The hardest part of a revolution is the morning after the fire. Anyone can burn a plantation. Anyone can scream freedom into the night. But when the smoke thins and daylight exposes what's left hungry people, scattered weapons, rival leaders, empty storehouses, fields that no longer feed anyone, then the real war begins. Not just against France, Spain, or Britain, but against collapse itself. Toussaint understood this with a clarity that made him seem cold to men who still wanted vengeance to feel like justice. He had watched too many lives disappear into chaos to romanticize it. Chaos was not liberation. Chaos was what the masters secretly hoped for, because chaos could be punished and then used as proof that the old order was necessary. So he did something that felt, to many, like betrayal of the dream. He began to build a state, not a paper state, not speeches, a functioning machine that could keep people alive long enough to stay free, an army that could march on empty stomachs for only so long, a countryside that could not fight if it starved. Freedom could not be defended with slogans. Freedom needed supply lines, and supply lines required labor. That truth was a blade. It cut through every fantasy. Saint-Domingue's wealth, its sugar, its coffee was the one thing European powers understood, the one reason they kept coming back with fleets and cannons. If the island stopped producing, it would starve, and the outside world would call it proof that black freedom meant ruin. If the island kept producing, it risked rebuilding the plantation system under a different name. Toussaint walked into this contradiction and did not blink. He chose survival. To keep the colony alive, he pushed people back into the fields, not as property, but as workers bound to the land by rules enforced with military authority. To some, it sounded like slavery's echo. It looked like men with rifles, telling freed people where they must work. It sounded like orders. It felt like someone else deciding your life again. And Toussaint knew exactly how it would be remembered. But he also knew what hunger does to revolutions. He knew what happens when soldiers desert to feed their families. He knew what happens when towns collapse into banditry and revenge killings. He knew what happens when Britain or Spain can promise stability in exchange for surrender. He had seen too many revolts die, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked structure. So the grind began, not the glamorous grind of battlefield charges, but the grinding work of discipline. Discipline is never popular. It is simply necessary. He reorganized forces that had once been loose bands of fighters into units that could move as one body. He promoted men who could follow orders and punished men who could not. He turned former slaves into officers, which meant teaching them not only how to fight, but how to command without becoming the masters they hated. That is a psychological transformation more violent than any musket shot. A man who has only known humiliation must learn to carry authority without using it as revenge. Some managed, some did not. Toussaint watched them carefully, because the revolution could be destroyed by its own generals as easily as by foreign invaders. His army had to become something European officers couldn't easily predict. They expected disorder. They expected panic. They expected men who would scatter when cannon thundered. Instead, they met forces that could retreat on purpose, regroup, strike again, vanish into hills, then reappear with precision. Toussaint made the island's geography part of his training. He taught his men the difference between bravery and waste. He taught them that the goal was not to die dramatically, but to win patiently. And he did not build this alone. Around him, the revolution was full of powerful figures, some loyal, some ambitious, some furious at the idea of any single man becoming too central. There was Henri Christophe, fierce and pragmatic, a man who could build and destroy with the same hands. There was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a blade of a man, carrying rage like a sacred duty. There was André Rigaud in the South, representing a different faction, a different social world-free people of color, with their own claims to leadership and status. These men did not always agree on what freedom should look like. They agreed only that the old order must not return, and even that agreement would be tested. Because while Toussaint was forging structure, enemies kept arriving. Britain came with the appetite of an empire that had already swallowed islands and continents. British officers looked at Saint-Domingue and saw profit. They told themselves they were bringing order. They brought chains in their cargo holds. They believed black fighters would break under professional troops. But the island fought back in ways Europe did not understand. The climate itself became a weapon. Yellow fever, silent, relentless, moved through foreign camps like an invisible army. The British buried men faster than they could replace them. Ships arrived full, then left half empty, not from battle alone, but from sickness that had no respect for uniforms. Toussaint understood that time was his ally. He didn't always need to defeat an army head-on. Sometimes he only needed to make them stay long enough to die. So he traded land for time, retreated when it was smart, attacked when it was lethal, and made the invaders bleed patience until patience ran out. But even as he fought Britain, he had to fight suspicion from within his own side. Because Toussaint's methods were not fueled by pure vengeance. He negotiated, he offered terms, he accepted the surrender of former enemies. He kept some white planters and technicians in place because he needed expertise to keep production running. To men who had watched their families whipped and sold, this looked unforgivable. To men who wanted the revolution to purify itself through fire, Toussaint looked like a man making peace with devils. Yet Toussaint's vision was colder. You do not build a future by killing everyone who knows how the present functions. You take what you need, you control it, and you reshape it. He was trying to build a world where emancipation could survive the next French political shift, the next invasion, the next betrayal. And betrayal was everywhere. The French Republic itself was unstable, lurching between radicalism and reaction. Commissioners came and went. Policies shifted with factions in Paris. One month, Toussaint was praised as a defender of the Republic. The next, he was treated like a potential threat. He could never fully trust France's gratitude, because gratitude from an empire is often just a pause before it demands more. So he built independence inside loyalty. He became, in practice, the most powerful man on the island, even while he spoke the language of serving France. His victories against foreign invaders gave him legitimacy. His ability to restore order gave him authority. His control over the army gave him leverage. And his intelligence networks, informants, couriers, local knowledge allowed him to see trouble forming before it erupted. Toussaint didn't just fight battles. He managed perception. He understood that fear could be redirected, that rumors could be weaponized, that the right message delivered at the right moment could prevent a revolt inside a revolt. But no revolution can avoid the moment when it must decide who leads. In the South, André Rigaud held power with his own army and his own supporters, many of them free people of color who feared being overshadowed by a black-led North. Class, color, history, all the fractures the colony had cultivated for decades did not disappear just because slavery was threatened. They resurfaced, sharper than ever, because now power was up for grabs. What followed was not simply a political disagreement. It was a civil war inside the revolution. Toussaint fought Rigaud and his forces in what became known as the War of Knives, an ugly struggle that revealed the revolution's deepest wounds. Brothers in the fight against slavery became enemies over who would inherit the future. The fighting was personal, bitter, and devastating. It was also strategic. If Toussaint could not unify the island under one command, foreign powers would exploit the division and restore slavery through the cracks. Victory came, but it came stained. Toussaint emerged with greater control, but also with greater enemies, including those who would never forgive him for crushing rivals who saw themselves as equally legitimate. To unify the island, he had to break parts of it. To secure freedom, he had to spill blood that was not foreign. This is the kind of grind documentaries rarely linger on, because it is morally uncomfortable. But it is real. And while Toussaint fought to consolidate power, he made another move that showed just how far he was willing to go to protect the revolution from reversal. He marched east. The Spanish side of the island, Santo Domingo, still held slavery, still represented a potential base for enemies, still stood as a reminder that emancipation on one half of the island could be undermined from the other. Toussaint moved with the logic of a man closing a door before the storm returns. He took control of the Eastern Territory, abolishing slavery there as well, extending the revolution's reach. It was a bold act, and it also made European powers look at him differently. Not as a useful black general, but as a ruler. And rulers are not tolerated for long by empires. By the time Toussaint had pushed back foreign invaders, restored a form of production, and unified the island under his command, Saint-Domingue was no longer simply a colony in revolt. It was an almost independent state in everything but name. The ports moved under his authority. The army answered to him. The countryside obeyed his regulations. The island's fate was being decided in Cap Français and in the mountains, not in Paris. This was the height of his power, and it was also the moment the old world began to sharpen its knives. Because the more Toussaint succeeded, the more terrifying he became. He was proof that enslaved people could overthrow the system. He was proof that black leadership could organize, govern, and defeat European armies. And proof is dangerous. Proof spreads. So, while Toussaint worked to stabilize his revolution somewhere far away, a new ruler in France was rising, one who did not like proof that contradicted his vision of empire. Napoleon Bonaparte did not see Saint-Domingue as a distant island. He saw it as a lock he intended to close again. Napoleon did not fear Saint-Domingue because it was far away. He feared it because it was contagious. A black-led army had defeated Europeans. A former slave had governed as if empire were negotiable. The sugar colony that made French merchants rich was slipping out of France's grip, and worse, its very existence made a mockery of the restored order Napoleon intended to build. He was not a man who tolerated mockery. He believed history was a horse, and he held the reins. So he reached across the Atlantic with the calm certainty of someone used to the world obeying. In France, the revolution that once promised universal liberty was hardening into something colder discipline, hierarchy, control. Napoleon wanted the colony back. He wanted the wealth. He wanted the strategic port. And behind the polished language of unity and peace, there was a darker intent that many sensed but few could prove, to bring slavery back where it had been abolished, to turn emancipation into a temporary inconvenience that could be undone with enough cannons. The expedition sailed in 1801 and 1802 like a floating verdict. Warships, transports, veterans of European battlefields, officers with medals and confidence. A command structure designed not only to win, but to humiliate. The commander was Charles Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, chosen not just for ability, but for loyalty, because this was personal for the regime. Napoleon did not want a compromise. He wanted submission. When the French arrived, they did not announce their true hunger. They arrived speaking softly, carrying proclamations like gifts. They spoke of peace, of reconciliation, of France embracing her children. They swore, with formal sincerity, that slavery would not be restored. They said Toussaint would be honored. They called him a great man, a defender of the Republic. They offered the kind of respect empires give when they want you to lower your guard. But Toussaint had survived too long to be seduced by tone. He had seen what paper meant when power was impatient. He had watched promises break in the heat of profit. Still, he also understood the horror of endless war. The island had already been bleeding for a decade. Families had been shattered. Towns had been burned and rebuilt and burned again. If there was a way to avoid mass slaughter while keeping freedom intact, it was worth trying. That was the knife edge he stood on. Defend liberty without destroying the people you claimed to liberate. The French strategy was a mirror of Toussaint's strength. They knew they could not simply charge into the interior and win quickly. The island was not a flat European field. It was mountains, ravines, forests, and pathways known intimately by men who had once escaped into them under the lash. The French came with discipline and artillery, but the land did not care. The land swallowed armies. So Leclerc tried to split the revolution from itself. He offered amnesty to officers. He flattered some and threatened others. He dangled promotions, titles, protection. He played on old resentments from the Civil War, on rivalries that had never fully healed. He spoke to men like Christophe and Dessalines, as if he could give them something Toussaint could not. He whispered the oldest colonial lie: "You don't need the revolution, you just need your place within the empire." And at first, that lie worked more than Toussaint wanted to admit. Some officers hesitated, some defected. Some believed, or chose to believe, that France might honor abolition while removing Toussaint as an obstacle. Some feared that continued resistance would turn the island into ashes. The French took towns. They raised tricolor flags over forts and called it restoration. They wrote letters to Paris, describing progress, describing Toussaint as stubborn but isolated. Toussaint did what he had always done when faced with a stronger opponent. He refused to fight the war on their terms. He pulled back into the interior. He made the French chase him. He used scorched earth when necessary, destroying supplies, burning what could not be defended, refusing to feed the invaders' machine. It was a terrible choice, because it meant destroying the very prosperity he had tried to preserve. But the alternative was worse: letting France rebuild a stable occupation that could later tighten into slavery with a bureaucrat's smile. And then the invisible ally arrived again, the one that had humbled Britain: disease. Yellow fever moved through the French ranks with the indifferent cruelty of nature. It did not care about Napoleon's ambition. It did not care about medals. It did not care about Europe's idea of superiority. It found warm bodies, crowded camps, and men unfamiliar with the island's fevers. It took them in days. It took them in weeks. It made officers tremble and vomit and collapse, staring at the ceiling of a Caribbean room and realizing that conquest could be undone by something smaller than a coin. The French began to lose men faster than they could replace them. They could still win battles. They could still seize ports. But their bodies were being collected like spoiled cargo. The expedition was rotting from the inside. Toussaint watched this and understood the cruel rhythm of war. Sometimes victory is simply staying alive long enough for the enemy to die. But the war was not only a contest of endurance. It was also a contest of trust. France's promises began to sound less convincing as rumors spread from other colonies. Rumors that slavery was being reestablished under French authority elsewhere. Rumors that black officers were being arrested and shipped away. Rumors that the same peace being offered in Saint-Domingue was really a net being tightened. The more these stories circulated, the more the revolution's fear hardened into certainty. Toussaint had been trying to hold the line between warfare and governance, between defiance and survival. Now the line started to break, because if slavery returned, all restraint became a kind of suicide. That realization hit the revolution like a bell struck in the chest. Men who had hesitated began to choose again. Defectors returned. Christophe and Dessalines, who had once entertained French offers, began to see the trap behind them. The struggle shifted from a dispute about authority to a fight for existence. And yet, at the center of it, Toussaint was still Toussaint strategic, controlled, still imagining a future where emancipation could be protected without turning the island into a permanent cemetery. He tried to negotiate, not from weakness, but from calculation. He believed he could secure guarantees, binding statements, legal commitments, something he could hold up against the empire's shifting moods. He believed, perhaps, that France would understand it could not rule this island through terror forever. He believed, perhaps, that the world's new language of rights could be made real if you forced it to speak consistently. It was the most human gamble he made, the gamble that an empire might keep its word when keeping its word was inconvenient. The French, meanwhile, were making their own calculation. Toussaint was not merely an enemy general. He was the spine of the revolution. Break him, and the body might collapse. They began to speak to him with increasing warmth. They praised his intelligence. They acknowledged his service to France. They offered reconciliation like a priest offers forgiveness, As if the problem was simply misunderstanding, they suggested that if he retired quietly, the island could have peace. Toussaint wanted peace. He also wanted freedom to survive peace. So he agreed to terms. He laid down arms under promises of security and respect. He retreated to his plantation at Ennery, a man who had lived through 10 years of fire, now trying to believe that paper might finally have weight. And that is how they caught him, not in battle, but in the moment when he tried to stop the killing. The arrest came with the suddenness of betrayal made official. Soldiers arrived with orders that did not tremble. Toussaint was seized, separated from his family, denied the dignity of explanation. He was taken to the coast, placed on a ship, and removed from the island as if he were a disease that could be contained by distance. It was not just imprisonment, it was an attempt to erase. They took him to France and locked him in the cold stone of Fort de Joux, a fortress in the Jura Mountains. Imagine the cruelty of that geography. A man of the Caribbean, a man shaped by heat and cane fields and tropical storms, placed into a world of ice air and thin light. The cell was not merely confinement, it was a slow suffocation. The cold gnawed at bones. Food was scarce. Letters were delayed or denied. Information was controlled. The intent was clear: starve the revolution's mind. In Saint-Domingue, people whispered the news with a kind of stunned silence. Toussaint captured, Toussaint gone. The man who had held so many moving parts together, removed like a key pulled from a machine. If Napoleon believed the story ended there, it was because he did not understand the kind of legacy Toussaint had created. Toussaint had taught his generals not only how to fight, but why. He had turned emancipation into a line that could not be crossed without igniting hell. He had shown them what France was capable of, how it could smile while sharpening a knife. His absence did not calm the revolution. It clarified it, because now the war was no longer about negotiating a place within an empire. It was about destroying the empire's ability to return. Dessalines and Christophe, hardened by betrayal and convinced that compromise meant chains, carried the fight forward with a ruthlessness that reflected the moment. The conflict escalated into a war where mercy became rare because slavery was the ultimate threat, and the French expedition was increasingly desperate. Meanwhile, yellow fever continued to eat the invaders alive. Leclerc himself fell to disease, another body claimed by the island's invisible defense. And in that calculus of death, Napoleon's grand plan began to collapse. Toussaint in his cell did not see the final battles. He did not see the French retreat. He did not see the birth of independence. He was held in stone while the island he had tried to stabilize erupted into a final uncompromising struggle. In Fort de Joux, he weakened. The cold sharpened. The food thinned. His body, once trained by hardship to endure, now endured a different kind of cruelty, slow, bureaucratic, suffocating. And as he faded, he left behind words that carried the bitter taste of truth. They could cut down the trunk of the tree of black liberty, he warned, but the roots were deep. They would grow back. They would spread. It is one of history's cruel ironies. Toussaint's greatest achievement was building a future strong enough to survive his removal. His greatest mistake was believing the empire would let him retire in peace. His victory was teaching the world that a slave could become the mind that unmade Napoleon's dream. His cost was discovering that empires fear minds more than armies, and will imprison a man not because he lost, but because he proved he could win. A man can be removed from the board without the game ending. That is what Napoleon never fully understood about Toussaint Louverture. He thought power worked like Europe had taught him. Cut off the head, the body obeys. Arrest the leader, the movement dissolves. Send the symbol into a cold fortress, and the island will drift back into the old profitable silence. But Saint-Domingue had crossed a threshold where silence was no longer possible. When Toussaint disappeared into French stone, the revolution did not soften. It sharpened. The betrayal made every doubt evaporate. It turned every hesitant man into a believer, not because belief is comforting, but because the alternative was chains. It became impossible to pretend that France's promises were anything more than a mask worn until the moment it could tighten again. So the war that followed Toussaint was not his style of war. It was harsher, more final, less interested in compromise. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, once Toussaint's fiercest instrument, became the face of a truth the island had learned through blood. If you leave an empire, the option to return, it will. If you give slavery a doorway, it will crawl back in. Dessalines fought like a man who believed history would punish hesitation. Henri Christophe fought with the hard pragmatism of a builder who knew the future required victory first. The revolution's surviving leaders did not abandon Toussaint's project. They completed it in a language he had tried, at times, to avoid, the language of irreversibility. France's expedition continued to rot. Yellow fever was still there, quietly collecting bodies, a disease that made European strategy feel like arrogance. The French command kept changing as men died or were replaced, and each new commander arrived with less patience, more brutality, and fewer illusions. The struggle became a spiral of atrocity and retaliation, because that is what slavery always was beneath the surface. A system that taught everyone violence, then pretended the violence belonged only to the enslaved. By late 1803, the dream of Napoleon's restored Caribbean empire was unraveling. France could not hold the island. Not with exhausted troops, not with sickness hollowing out regiments, not with black soldiers who now knew, with absolute clarity, what defeat would mean. The final battles became a closing fist. And then, the moment came that would echo around the world for centuries. France was beaten. In January of 1804, Saint-Domingue became Haiti, an independent nation born from the only successful slave revolt to create a state. The name itself mattered. It was not a French name. It was reclaiming a signal that the island would not simply be a colony with a new manager. It would be its own origin story. This is the part where myths tend to celebrate and end. But a real documentary does not end with fireworks. It ends with the bill. Because victory did not mean peace. Victory meant Haiti standing alone in a world built by slave empires. It meant plantation economies and global powers staring at this black republic like it was a threat to the very idea of their wealth. Haiti's existence was a living accusation. If enslaved people could overthrow a superpower here, what might happen elsewhere? Every slaveholder in the Americas understood the danger immediately. Every colonial governor heard the message like a heartbeat in the walls. So Haiti was punished, not always with cannon fire, but with isolation, embargo, and the slow suffocation of a nation denied legitimacy. The new country inherited ruins, burned plantations, fractured social structures, a population exhausted by war. It inherited enemies who could not forgive what Haiti symbolized. Toussaint's legacy sits inside that contradiction like a seed in hard soil. He is remembered as the mind that made the impossible feasible, a former slave who mastered the mechanics of European warfare and turned them against Europe. A man who understood that freedom without organization could be crushed, and who tried imperfectly to build institutions strong enough to defend emancipation. He was the bridge between the uprising and the state, between raw revolt and disciplined resistance. And yet, he is also remembered through the bitter taste of his compromises. Because Toussaint's obsession with survival led him to policies that felt, to many, like freedom, wearing the old uniform. His labor regulations forced people back into plantation work under military discipline. His decision to preserve production saved the economy in the short term, but left wounds in the long term. His willingness to negotiate with white planters and foreign powers looked, to some, like a dangerous softness. His civil war against rivals revealed that liberation could reproduce hierarchy if power was not watched closely. This is why his story remains so haunting. He is not a clean hero. He is a real one. He is a man who fought slavery while wrestling with the question of what replaces it. He is a leader who wanted order because disorder meant invasion, starvation, and a return to chains. He is a strategist who believed in paper law enough to be betrayed by it. He is proof that revolutions are made by human beings, brilliant, flawed, pressured by impossible choices. And then there is the final cruelty. Toussaint did not live to see the nation his struggle made possible. In Fort de Joux, he died in 1803, still held by the empire he had outmaneuvered. Cold, hunger, and isolation finished what armies could not. He was buried far from the cane fields that had shaped him, far from the island that had turned him from property into power. The empire tried to reduce him to a prisoner number, a lesson to anyone who might follow. But history did the opposite. His name escaped the fortress and traveled. Abolitionists invoked him as living evidence that enslaved people were not passive victims, but political actors capable of statecraft and military genius. Revolutionaries saw in him the terrifying possibility that an empire could be beaten by the people it exploited. Black intellectuals, Caribbean leaders, and freedom movements across centuries return to his story not because it is comfortable, but because it is instructive. Toussaint's life leaves us with a lesson that is both inspiring and unsettling. Oppression does not only steal labor, it steals imagination. It teaches the oppressed to think small, to think temporary, to think survival is all they deserve. Toussaint broke that spell, not with a single heroic gesture, but with decades of preparation hidden inside silence. He turned literacy into a weapon. He turned patience into a strategy. He turned an empire's arrogance into a weakness. And he proved that a man can be born in chains and still become the kind of mind that rewrites the world. But he also shows the price of rewriting it. Freedom won through war carries trauma into the future. Order built under siege can resemble the tyranny it replaces. Victories that terrify the powerful invite retaliation that lasts for generations. Haiti's birth was a miracle, but it was also an alarm bell, and the world responded to that bell with punishment. So when we speak Toussaint's name, we are not only telling a story about one man defeating Napoleon's dream. We are asking a deeper question about what it takes to truly liberate a people, and what kind of world rises from the ashes afterward. And that brings it back to you. If a 50-year-old man, dismissed as property, could outthink empires and ignite a nation's freedom, what excuse do the rest of us have for surrendering to the labels the world tries to put on us? And here's the question I want to leave you with. If you had lived in Saint-Domingue, standing at the edge of freedom, staring at the risk of everything, would you have chosen Toussaint's path of discipline and compromise to protect survival? Or Dessalines' path of total, irreversible war to protect liberty?